All right, welcome back to Please Read Your Book. My name's Carl. I'm going to talk about some books. So, didn't make a video last week. I was pretty sick. I'm still a little bit sick now. You can tell my voice is a bit scratchy or whatever. Fall has definitely arrived in Shanghai. We've had some cold temperatures. Students get sick and then they pass it on to their teachers. So I did read a couple books. I read 2 books that I had to read for school. I'll share those real quick and then I'll talk about another book. So the first one was Howl's Moving Castle by Diana Wynne Jones. This is a great book. It's a kid's book. It's a children's book. It's about between 4th and 6th grade, but really well written. Really fascinating story. I was really pleased with it. A lot of books at this age are not well written, like Harry Potter. That is an absolute trash bin of writing, but this is very good, excellent. I will have to do a video on that. And then I also read this one. Did not like this. Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Book 1, The Lightning Thief. Not very good. Not very well written, but we will read this with our students for our novel study at near the end of the semester. So I had to read that. But I'm sure the kids will like it. So the book that I did enjoy was this one. This is a big boy book. The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh. Yeah, wow. The cover is great. I really like that cover. Especially because it kind of riffs on the Vietnamese propaganda posters. You still see this style of poster used in Vietnam, by the way. So anyways, yeah, this was a really great book, really powerful book. This was a reread for me, but I first read it a long time ago. A little bit of history behind this book, and I'll tell you how I first read it. So it's written by Bao Ninh. He was a teenager when he was fighting with the North Vietnamese army against the Americans and the South Vietnamese army. So he was a teenager then, so he had direct experience with the war. Interestingly enough, though, he did not write this book until the late, I think about 88 or 89. And he typed it out by hand on a typewriter and made mimeograph, which is kind of like a hand-cranked photocopy, a very sort of low-tech photocopy. He made copies of it kind of like you would make a zine copy, really. And he circulated that around literary circles in Vietnam, particularly in Hanoi. So Hanoi has always kind of been the sort of intellectual center of the country. It was given a very rough translation, and one of those rough translations was sent to an Australian journalist who had been a journalist during the Vietnam War in Vietnam and was familiar with, things that had happened in the war and had sort of stayed in touch with Vietnamese people. He was really impressed by it. He gave it a rewrite, sent the rewrite back to the translator. The translator showed it to Bao Ninh, and Bao Ninh was really happy with it and said, yeah, this is, I think this is a good translation of what I was trying to do. I think it was rewritten again and expanded a bit. Then in English, it was sold to a British publisher, and it was published in 1990 and then was banned in Vietnam until 2006. And I kind of chuckle at that because I first went to Vietnam in 1999, and I bought the book in Hanoi, in a bookstore in Hanoi. I mean, it was a photocopied version. They were selling tons of bootleg photocopies of all kinds of books. There were stacks of it. You never would have guessed that the book was banned. And I remember I was with some Vietnamese people at the time, and they kind of were serious but half joking, like, oh, be careful with that book. That book is banned. If you've ever been to Vietnam or if you know Vietnamese people, they are the masters of the black market. So nothing is ever truly banned in Vietnam. So kind of an interesting thing there. All kidding aside, though, this is an incredibly powerful, incredibly haunting novel of the Vietnam War, obviously told from the perspective of, a Vietnamese soldier fighting against the Americans. So the story starts, it's a story of Kien, who is a North Vietnamese soldier. And it starts after the war has finished, and he has been tasked with kind of an MIA mission. He's retrieving bodies from a field in a jungle, a patch of jungle in the south where he fought once before. And this patch of jungle is called the Jungle of Screaming Souls. Did I get that correct? I have to look at my notes here. Yeah, the Jungle of Screaming Souls. Sorry about that. It's called that because the people in the area believe that if you die here, your soul stays there, and at night, your soul or your spirit or your ghost will not necessarily haunt people, but will come out and talk to whoever is there, and it will be so realistic that the living won't know that's the spirit of a dead person. And in fact, Kien knows this already because his battalion fought in that field against the Americans and were nearly wiped out. He was like one of maybe 4 or 5 that survived. It was a brutal attack, brutal battle. The Americans basically just wiped out this battalion. They used everything they could: artillery, heavy machine gun fire, helicopters, and of course napalm. And so it was just this horrific bloodbath, really. But Kien knew that because on the eve of that battle, his battalion had been staying there, and his friends had been sneaking off to see some girls at night. But it turned out the girls were actually ghosts, and he didn't know how to tell them to say hey, stop, don't see them anymore. They're ghosts, And he's also kind of conflicted, and there's a bit of it's not exactly clear. It's kind of implied that the sort of transgression between the living and the dead in their relationship may have brought about bad luck and caused their such heavy losses in the battle that came later. So, but that's kind of that's not exactly clear. But what that is that's the first of many flashbacks, recounts, and reminiscences on behalf of Kien of his life. So his life before the war, during the war, and after the war. And really the whole novel is I shouldn't say just, but the whole novel is this sort of interweaving and intermingling of memories of his life. And it moves back and forth and sideways in time. And there are many sections too where it's not exactly evident or clear what year it is or where he is or what's happened or where this is in the timeline of history and also of his life. But it kind of, as you're reading it, at first sometimes you get a little puzzled and you're wondering where is this? Where does this happen? But then you realize it doesn't really matter because these are all his memories and it's all him. And this is really the story of him and his life. And it's not just him though, it's the story of Vietnamese people and different people in different aspects of society, which leads to the core of his memories and his reminiscences throughout the war, throughout his life. Basically, I shouldn't say throughout, but from the point that he leaves Hanoi. So he joins the army and leaves Hanoi, and from then on, he's constantly reminiscing of his high school girlfriend, a girl named Phung, who is, of course, very beautiful, very demure, if you will. On the eve of leaving for the war, she sort of engineers this situation where they can sleep together to sort of consummate their relationship before he leaves, and he kind of chickens out and can't go through with it. And that haunts him. He's constantly regretting that. And he's always reminiscing about her and wondering about her and dreaming about her, and he kind of really has this whole thing in his mind built up about her. And when he goes back to Hanoi after the war, he finds out how difficult things have actually been for her and for the people in his neighborhood and for his family and his loved ones. And specifically in her case, she's become a prostitute because there was no other way for her to get any food or earn any kind of living. And that is quite a devastating thing, as one can imagine. And in some way, he feels guilty for that. He feels responsible for that. And that just really tears him apart. And that kind of just basically rips his whole mind and soul apart. He drinks very heavily. He tries to write a novel, which is basically the story of him and Fung. And that kind of drives him crazy and over the edge. He tries to burn that novel, but a prostitute that he has met that night rescues the novel. And at this point, kind of the fourth wall is broken, and the narrator is revealed to actually be the author, Bao Ninh, who is rewriting and editing and fixing up this manuscript for Kien, who could not finish it. So it gets really it's one of those like moments where you're like, wait a minute, so who is Kien? Is Kien Bao? Is Kien real? Is Bao Kien? It gets really like puzzling. But then it doesn't really matter because, like I said, it's a very like complex, it's a very sophisticated novel. And you realize that this is really just a series of memories and reminiscences and experiences that are probably not just one person. They're probably dozens of different people that have just sort of all been embodied into Kien. And Kien is actually like a really, really common Vietnamese name. It's kind of an everyman's name, like Joe or something like that. So you can't help but wonder, like, was that purposely done to show that this character is kind of everybody and nobody at the same time? So there's kind of that going on. It's a really interesting novel. It's really, in some ways, it's really complex because of the lack of, there's no chapters, there's no acts, it just starts. And there's breaks, but that's literally just, 2 lines to break apart a paragraph, and then the next section starts. And often when a section starts too, like it's not always clear. Is it the future? Is it the past? We don't really know. And it doesn't really matter. As you start to read it, you realize it doesn't really matter. What matters is sort of letting this person, this narrator, whoever it is, whether it's Kien or Bao or someone else, letting them tell this story, which is a cycle that begins when he's in the jungle of screaming souls and not retrieving the bodies, but when he's there at the very first time he enters that jungle, that sort of cycle of needing to tell a story to kind of free yourself or to get something out when these spirits in that jungle are talking to him and telling him their stories. So really, really, really interesting novel. It's highly sophisticated. I had forgotten like how sophisticated it was. I remembered some of the narrative of it. I had remembered that it's about him retrieving bodies from the jungle and the struggles after the fall of Saigon, the struggles that northern Vietnam went through. It's pretty interesting. And there's a lot of very interesting parallels too between the experiences of the northern Vietnamese soldiers and the experiences of the American soldiers. So for example, and this is true, after the reunification after Saigon fell and the reunification, there was quite a big train, quite a massive train was put together to allow northern Vietnamese soldiers who were in the South to go back to the north, to go back to Hanoi. And that train was stopped repeatedly on its way back up north by northern Vietnamese government officers and army officers. And they searched the train, they constantly searched the train, searched the belongings of the soldiers, and accused the North Vietnamese soldiers of pillaging the luxury goods, basically, of the South. And they were sort of like scrutinized. And that's a pretty significant point in the story. It's a significant point in history, in that those soldiers realized, if they did not know already, they knew then that they weren't really heroes, they weren't going to get a hero's welcoming, and that they were, just in some ways unwelcome in their own country and going back. And that's similar to how many American soldiers who went back to America after the war were not really welcomed back, and were scrutinized and were seen as monsters and as horrible people who did horrible things. So, all right, so I'm kind of losing my voice here, so I'm going to have to wrap it up. This is a really great novel. It's a very complex novel. It's very sophisticated. It's very psychological. I'd highly recommend it if you are interested in reading contemporary Asian literature. I know that's like just a huge umbrella term to throw out there, but not a lot of people read books from other countries. I guess I'll put it that way. Specifically books from Asia, and specifically books from Vietnam. Unfortunately, not a lot of Vietnamese literature gets translated into English. This is one of the books that has, and it's a very important book, and I really think it's worth reading. So even if you have just an interest in the Vietnam War, this is a great book to give you perspectives of the experiences and the difficulties that the Vietnamese faced in that time. So there you go. My name's Carl. This has been Please Read Your Book, and I hope to see you again soon.